Hello, guys. Buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches, depending on when you're watching this video. This is, if I'm not mistaken, the 8th of our online Spanish classes. And just as a reminder, because there's still a couple people that have not submitted it, I'm still taking in the midterm. The only thing you need to do is send me 8 sentences in Spanish, of course, about your typical day using are verbs. All right, using that first group of regular verbs, of verbs that follow a pattern that we studied. Verbs like cantar, estudiar, pensar, trabajar. You have a lot of those in the list that I gave you physically when I introduced those verbs a few weeks ago. And also, if you were present on that last day of physical class when we did the midterm review and you got that packet, in that same packet you have exactly the same verb list that I gave you when I taught those verbs, okay? So it's fairly simple, just 8 sentences in Spanish about your typical day using some of those verbs. That will replace your midterm grade, and it's very important because as I have said several times, we are not having any more exams for this class, only the activities that I'm giving you every day. And with that, let's move on to the topic of the day. Um, I'm not gonna lie to you. It's a topic of some complexity, but I do think that what we have done so far has prepared us more than sufficiently for this. We're going to be looking at yet another group of verbs today, but they're very special verbs. They're called modal verbs. In Spanish, of course, verbos modales. All right. So before we actually look at these in Spanish, I want us to think about how they work in English for a bit, because actually um, it's quite similar to the way that it works in Spanish. So let me remind you, for starters, that as we have studied this semester, and as I have told you several times, verbs are the words that we use to talk about actions, right? About the things that can be done in the world. Some examples: to play, to study, to read, to rest. All of those are verbs. Let me remind you as well that these verbal forms that I just listed, verbal forms that refer to the action in general, right? To the action as in it's not being done by anybody. I just want to talk about the action in the abstract, right? Those are called infinitives. And the infinitive in English is constructed with this little word before the verb to, right? If you say to play, it does not mean that anybody is playing, right? You're just referring to the action of playing in general. Same thing with to study. You're not saying that I study or he studies, whatever. No one is doing the action of studying. You just want to talk about it in the abstract, so you say to study. Those are called infinitives, okay? So these are the basics of the verbs, and today, as I told you, we're going to study a new type of verbs. They're called modal verbs. And the thing with modal verbs is that they're never used by themselves. They're always used with another verb. They're combined with other verbs. Because what they do is express an additional nuance, an additional piece of information about the main action, right? Something like a desire to do it, or a need to do it, or the ability to do it. Okay? So, in short, modal verbs are never used alone. They are always combined with other verbs. Okay? Let's look at 3 examples of modal verbs in English. To have to be able to, and to want. Let's look at some specific examples. I want to study. If you look at this sentence carefully, you will see that there's a subject, right? I, subject being, of course, the person or people that are doing the action. Then you have a verb, want, and a second verb, to study, right? This is not I study, right? Which would be just one subject and one verb. It's I want to study, the subject followed by two verbs, right? And as you can see, the modal verb is modifying the main verb, right? It's expressing a desire to do that action, right? This is the way that a modal verb works. Let's look at another one. He is able to eat. Exactly the same structure, right? Subject followed by two verbs, right? To be able to and then to eat. And then a third example, we have to work. Same thing. We is the subject, have is the modal verb, and then to work is the main verb. So you will notice that I have colored these sentences in a very specific way, right? Because I want to make it clear how they are constructed. All of them start with a subject marked in green, right, which is the person or people doing the action. Then the subject is followed by a modal verb, which is colored in red, and then by a blue verb, right? That's the main verb. Now, let's look at those three examples for a bit, because I want you to notice something very important about how we are using each of the verbs. Let's look at the second example. I think that's the clearest. He is able to eat, right? Of course, I say he is able to eat. I don't say he am able, right? I don't say he are able. I say he is able, right? Because it's he, right? What I'm saying here is that we are conjugating the verb to be able to so that it corresponds to the subject he, right? Remember that conjugating means changing a verb so that it matches its subject, so that it matches whoever is doing the action, right? So that is why I don't say he am able to. I would say I am able to. I would say he is able to. I would say you are able to eat, right? I have to change that modal verb. I have to conjugate it so that it matches the subject, okay? What I'm saying in short is that the modal verb has to be conjugated. That being the verb in red in these three examples. Now let's look at the verbs in blue. Are those conjugated? No. What form of the verb is that one? It's the infinitive, right? So in a sentence that uses a modal verb, you conjugate only one of the two verbs, and that's the modal verb, okay? The structure is as follows. Subject followed by a conjugated modal verb followed by the infinitive of the main verb, okay? That's the way it works in English. The cool thing is that that's also the way that it works in Spanish. So this should be actually easy for you English speakers, right? Let's look at three modal verbs in Spanish. Tres verbos modales en español. They are the equivalents of what we just did. Deber means to have to. Poder means to be able to, and querer means to want. And they are modal verbs, of course, because they are always used in combination with other verbs, and they modify those verbs by telling us that these actions are necessary, possible, or desired, right? And let's look at the structure. Exactly the same one. Subject followed by conjugated modal verb followed by the infinitive of the second verb. And I'm doing it in the same colors that we used in the last slide so that it's as clear as possible. So let's look at some of these examples. Yo quiero cantar means I want to sing. Exactly the same structure in the same order, right? Yo, you guys already know that. That means I. Then quiero is the form of querer, which corresponds to yo. So that modal verb has been conjugated. And then cantar, that's the infinitive of that verb, which means to sing, right? Remember, as I told you several times in class, that the infinitives in Spanish always end in either ar, or ir. So this one ends in ar, right? Subject, conjugated modal verb, and infinitive of the main verb. Second example, ella debe estudiar means she has to study. Ella is the subject. Debe is the modal verb conjugated. And then estudiar is the main verb in the infinitive, right? Exactly the same thing. Last example, nosotros podemos terminar. Same thing. Nosotros is the subject, the people doing the action. That means we. Podemos is the modal verb conjugated for the subject nosotros, right? And then terminar, that's the infinitive of the verb that means to finish. So nosotros podemos terminar means we are able to finish, okay? So hopefully this will have made it clear how you use modal verbs in Spanish, okay? For this 101, we're only going to study these three modal verbs, deber, poder, and querer. There's a lot more, but these are the most basic. And honestly, once you learn to use these, you have a huge percentage of the usage of modal verbs in Spanish, right? Because those are the main things that you want to say about an action, either that you want to do it, or that you're able to do it, or that you have to do it, right? So let's look at the actual conjugation of these. It's right here in this table. So deber goes like this. Yo debo, tú debes. Él, ella, usted debe. Nosotros debemos. Ustedes deben. Ellos deben. If you look at it carefully, you will notice that it's a regular verb. In fact, I hope some of you remember that I had already given you this verb in the list of the regular verbs that we did when we studied those, okay? So this is very easy to conjugate. You already know how to do it, right? You get rid of the of the last two letters, and then you apply the endings. O, es, hemos, en, right? So you already know how to conjugate the verb. Now, poder and querer are somewhat different, right? Poder goes yo puedo, tú puedes, él puede, nosotros podemos, ustedes pueden, ellos pueden. And querer goes yo quiero, tú quieres, él quiere, nosotros queremos, ustedes quieren, ellos quieren. Okay? Now, I know I have done this for almost all of the verb lessons in these virtual classes that I tell you that I don't need you to memorize their conjugation. That's not going to be the case for this one. I'm going to ask you to try and memorize these last two. Please memorize poder, its conjugation, meaning this little table that you have here, and also memorize querer. Okay? Why? Because that's going to help you immensely with the next two topics. Okay? These two verbs are very special, and they follow a very useful rule that we're going to be using soon. So by telling you to memorize them, I'm actually doing you a favor. Okay? So please do that. It shouldn't be too difficult. By now, you should be quite familiar with the toil of memorizing a verb in Spanish, right? Just, choose whatever strategy works best for you, recite it, write it on an index card, tell your, I don't know, tell your toddler to, bang a pan repeating it. I don't know, right? Some of you even have children that speak Spanish, right? So just tell them to say it over and over again. Whatever works best for you, but do your best to memorize these, okay? And they will help you a lot. Okay, so that's the topic for today. The activity is quite simple. I want you to please send me a file with 3 sentences in Spanish using these modal verbs. 1 sentence for deber, 1 sentence for poder, 1 sentence for querer. Of course, since these are modal verbs, you can't use them by themselves, right? You have to use yet another verb, right? But it can be very simple, just like the examples I used here, right? Subject, then conjugated modal verb, and then another verb in the infinitive. But please don't use the examples, the actual examples I used here, right? Don't send me yo quiero cantar, that's not cool. Just change it a little, right? But it's quite simple. Just, change the subject and then change the verb in the infinitive or whatever, right? And you'll be done, okay? It's just a little bit of practice with the modal verbs before we move on to other stuff, okay? Gracias. And again, a short reminder, I am not being strict with deadlines this semester because I know that everyone's going through very challenging times. So please don't fret if you have missed, 2 or 3 activities or whatever. Just send me stuff, okay? Send me stuff via email, via WhatsApp, right? There's even a couple students from whom I have not received anything. I was checking today on Cunifers because I thought that you guys might have dropped out. No, you're still there. So you can still catch up, okay? Even if you haven't sent me anything, just watch the videos, do the activities. Honestly, it takes like 2 to 3 minutes each activity per video, okay? And that way you can catch up and rejoin this class and actually do quite decently if you do the activities correctly, okay? Okay, guys, gracias, and hasta mañana, right? Bye bye, ciao ciao.